Let's face it, almost everyone knows what it's like or, knows someone who's been through a romantic breakup.
Mhm.
It's a really common experience, but have you ever stopped to think about how wildly different people's emotional journeys are afterward?
Yeah, absolutely. Some seem to just, well, shrug it off almost.
Right. And move
Yeah.
on. While for others, it feels like this really long, difficult climb.
Absolutely. And that's precisely what we're diving into today. We've got a fascinating study here titled Depressive Symptom Trajectory Following Romantic Relationship Breakup and Effects of Rumination, Neuroticism, and Cognitive Control.
Okay.
And what's really interesting is that it followed 87 women for a solid 30 weeks after a breakup.
Wow, 30 weeks.
Yeah, giving us a pretty detailed picture of those different emotional pathways, at least for, this specific group.
Right. And by focusing just on this group, the researchers could uncover some really nuanced insights. And that's kind of our goal for you today. We want to unpack these different patterns of emotional recovery and maybe figure out what might be influencing whether someone bounces back quickly or, well, really struggles.
Think of it as a shortcut, maybe.
Yeah, exactly. A quick guide to understanding the surprisingly complex ways we all handle heartbreak.
And what emerged from this 30-week look were four distinct groups, each with a different trajectory of depressive symptoms.
Okay, 4 groups.
First, we saw a resilience group. These were the women who reported low levels of depressive symptoms right from the start, and thankfully, that stayed consistent.
That's the ideal, I suppose.
You think so, yeah.
Hmm.
Then there was the fast recovery group.
Okay.
These women started off reporting higher depressive symptoms, but what's encouraging is that those symptoms decreased relatively quickly over the study period.
So a bit of a dip, but then back up.
Pretty much. The third path was the slow recovery group.
Right.
Similarly to the fast recovery group, they also began with higher depressive symptoms, but their improvement was, well, more gradual. It took more time over those 30 weeks.
A longer climb then.
A longer climb, yeah. And then, sadly, there was the chronic distress group.
Uh-oh.
These individuals reported high levels of depressive symptoms that unfortunately persisted. They stayed high throughout the entire 30 weeks of the study.
Wow, that's tough. Just stuck in it.
Yeah. Now, what makes this study particularly insightful isn't just, identifying these different paths.
Right.
The researchers also explored some key factors that might explain why people end up on one path versus another.
Okay, what kind of factors?
They looked at things like personality traits, specifically neuroticism and rumination, and also something called cognitive control.
Okay, let's dig into that. We all have a general idea of,
Right.
personality, but how did they actually measure neuroticism and rumination?
Sure, they used established questionnaires right at the beginning of the study.
Standard stuff.
Pretty much.
Mhm.
For neuroticism, which is that tendency towards negative emotions and maybe emotional instability,
Right.
they used part of a well-regarded personality assessment, the NEO 5-factor inventory.
And for rumination, which is really about how we think when we're feeling down, they use the ruminative response scale.
Got it.
And what's helpful about this scale is that it also distinguishes between different kinds of rumination.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, and that turned out to be quite important.
Different kinds. Like,
Yes. Specifically, they looked at brooding rumination and reflective rumination.
brooding versus reflective, okay?
Brooding is generally seen as, well, less helpful. It's when you keep passively dwelling on negative feelings, the reasons for them, the bad things that might happen.
Like getting stuck.
Exactly, like getting stuck in a loop of negativity without really trying to find solutions.
Mm-hmm.
Reflective rumination, on the other hand, is more about actively trying to understand your feelings and, figure out how to cope or move forward.
Okay, that distinction makes a lot of sense. Just stewing versus trying to understand.
Precisely. So they look at these personality aspects, and then how did they assess cognitive control? That sounds a bit more technical.
Yeah, what's that about?
They used a couple of interesting cognitive tasks. One was the Stroop color naming task.
Oh, I think I know that one. Like the word BLUE in red ink.
Exactly that. It measures how well you can say red instead of automatically reading blue.
Right.
It taps into what's called inhibitory control, your ability to suppress an automatic response for a less obvious one.
Okay.
The other task was the trail making test, which has 2 parts.
Trail making.
Yeah. Part A is pretty straightforward, mostly looking at attention and how quickly you can connect numbered circles in order, like 1 to 2 to 3.
Speed and focus.
Exactly. Part B is more complex. You have to switch between connecting numbers and letters in order like 1A, 2B, 3C.
Ah, okay, switching back and forth.
Right, and that's designed to measure cognitive flexibility, your
Hmm.
ability to shift between different tasks or mental sets.
Gotcha. So, okay, we have these four potential emotional paths after a breakup.
Hmm.
And the researchers were looking at how your personality, neuroticism, rumination, and these cognitive abilities might make you more or less likely to end up on a particular path.
Exactly.
So here's where it gets really interesting for you, I think. What did they actually find? What were the connections?
Okay, let's start with how personalities seem to play a role. The study revealed some pretty clear trends.
Yeah.
Both the women in the slow recovery group and those in the chronic distress group reported significantly higher levels of neuroticism.
That tendency towards negative emotions.
Right. And a greater overall tendency to ruminate compared to the women who showed resilience.
That almost feels intuitive, doesn't it?
It does, somewhat.
If you're someone who tends to feel things more intensely, maybe dwells on negative stuff, it makes sense a big event like a breakup might hit harder.
Exactly, and take longer to recover from. And the chronic distress group really stood out here.
How so?
They not only had higher neuroticism than the resilient group, but also significantly higher levels compared to the fast recovery group.
Ah, so even compared to those who bounce back quickly.
Yes. So it really seems like that underlying tendency to experience negative emotions can be a strong predictor of how quickly or slowly you might recover.
And what about those different types of rumination you mentioned? Brooding versus reflective. Did one matter more?
Yes, and this is a really key insight for you, I
Oh,
think.
yeah.
While overall rumination was higher in the slow recovery and chronic distress groups compared to the resilient group,
Right.
when the researchers looked closer at the two subtypes, only brooding rumination showed a significant difference between the groups.
Only brooding, not the reflective kind.
Exactly.
Hmm.
Specifically, the women in the chronic distress group reported much higher levels of that passive negative dwelling, the brooding, compared to the resilient group.
Wow.
This really underscores the idea that it's not just about thinking about the breakup, but how you're thinking about it that seems to have a big impact.
So it's not just processing, but if you get stuck in those negative loops, just replaying the bad feelings without trying to find a way forward, that seems to be a significant factor in staying distressed for longer.
Mm.
That's definitely something to think about.
Precisely. Now, let's shift gears a bit and talk about what the study uncovered regarding cognitive control and those different recovery paths.
Okay, yeah, this is the part I was really curious about. How did those cognitive tasks, like the trail making test, differentiate the women?
The trail making test showed some particularly interesting differences, especially when comparing the chronic distress group to the resilience group.
What did they see?
The women in the chronic distress group showed poorer overall performance on both Part A and Part B of the test.
Okay, so they were slower connecting the numbered circles in part A.
Suggesting maybe issues with focus or processing speed.
And they also had more trouble switching between numbers and letters in part B.
Mm.
What does that tell us?
Well, the poorer performance on Part B, which measures cognitive flexibility, is potentially really revealing for you. Think about it. After a breakup, you have to adapt to so many changes, right? New routines, social dynamics, maybe living arrangements.
Yeah, everything changes.
Exactly. That ability to mentally switch gears and adapt is what cognitive flexibility is all about.
Ah,
The
okay.
study suggests that those in chronic distress might find these kinds of mental shifts more challenging.
Making it harder to move forward.
Potentially, yes.
That really ties into the rumination piece too, doesn't it? If you're less able to mentally shift away from negative thoughts,
Right.
it makes sense you might get stuck in those brooding patterns more easily.
Absolutely. There's a strong theoretical link there.
Mm.
And there was another subtle but potentially important finding related to the trail making test
Oh,
at the very beginning of the study, right at baseline.
yeah.
Even though the women in the chronic distress and slow recovery groups reported similar levels of depression at that point,
Okay, same starting depression levels.
the chronic distress group already showed slower cognitive flexibility on Part B compared to the slow recovery group.
Whoa, really? So even before the recovery paths diverged much?
Exactly. It hints that there might be some pre-existing differences in cognitive flexibility that could make some individuals more vulnerable to prolonged distress after a breakup happens.
Wow, that's a really interesting point. So it's not just the emotional fallout, but maybe some underlying differences in how our brains process things.
That's what it suggests, yeah. differences in how we adapt that might influence our recovery journey.
Hmm.
And the study also explored the relationship between those personality traits we talked about, neuroticism, rumination, and cognitive control.
What did they find there?
They found that higher levels of neuroticism, that tendency towards negative emotions, was associated with worse performance on both parts of the trail making test.
So worse on speed and focus, and worse on flexibility.
Correct.
So it's like there's a potential interconnection here. Someone who tends to be more emotionally reactive might also have a harder time with cognitive flexibility,
Plausibly, yes.
well, which could then make it tougher to navigate and recover from something stressful, like a breakup. It's almost like a cascade of factors.
That's a really insightful way to put it. The study points towards a potential interplay where individuals prone to negative emotions might also face challenges with cognitive flexibility, possibly increasing their vulnerability to longer-lasting distress.
All right.
Interestingly, though, in their overall sample, they didn't find a strong link between general rumination itself and performance on these cognitive tasks. It was really that neuroticism factor that stood out in relation to cognitive performance.
Okay, so in this study, it seems like that underlying tendency towards negative emotions, neuroticism, was a stronger predictor of cognitive performance in this context than just the general tendency to ruminate.
That seems to be the case here, yes.
Now, this study focused on a non-clinical group, right? Women who had a breakup but weren't necessarily in treatment.
Correct.
How might these findings give us a broader understanding of maybe depression itself?
That's a crucial question. By looking at these kinds of emotional transitions in a, general population,
Hmm.
we can gain valuable insights into how some people might move from relatively normal well-being to experiencing more significant depressive symptoms.
Like the early stages, maybe?
Potentially, yes.
Yeah.
The factors highlighted here, high neuroticism, that maladaptive brooding rumination, difficulties with cognitive flexibility, these are also frequently observed in individuals experiencing clinical depression.
Ah, okay.
So, understanding how these factors play out after a stressful life event like a breakup could offer important clues about vulnerability factors and the mechanisms involved in developing more severe, persistent depressive episodes.
So it's almost like we're seeing a snapshot of how everyday emotional challenges can, for some people, unfortunately escalate.
Exactly, escalate into more serious mental health concerns
Hmm.
by getting a better handle on these different recovery paths and the factors linked to them. Right.
We might eventually be able to develop more targeted ways to support people going through tough transitions, potentially helping to prevent that chronic distress from setting in.
Right, intervening earlier, perhaps.
That would be the hope.
Okay, so just to bring it all together for you, the listener, we explored these 4 really different ways people seem to emotionally recover after a romantic breakup.
Resilience, fast recovery, slow recovery, chronic distress.
Right. And the study really shone a light on some key connections.
Yes. We saw that those who experience slower recovery or chronic distress tended to report higher levels of that underlying negative emotionality, neuroticism,
Hmm.
and a greater tendency to ruminate overall compared to the resilient group.
Okay.
And digging a bit deeper, the chronic distress group reported higher neuroticism even than the fast recovery group.
Right, really emphasizing that negative emotionality impact.
Definitely. And that particularly unhelpful form of rumination,
Mm.
the brooding, just getting stuck.
Yeah, the negative dwelling. That seemed significantly more prevalent in the chronic distress group compared to those who bounced back more easily.
That's a key takeaway.
Absolutely. And then looking at cognitive control.
Right, the trail making test.
The chronic distress group showed poorer performance, suggesting difficulties with focus, speed, and especially that mental flexibility needed to adapt when compared to the resilient group.
And that intriguing early finding.
Yes, where the chronic distress group already showed less cognitive flexibility compared to the slow recovery group, even when their initial depression scores were similar.
Suggesting pre-existing factors might be at play.
Exactly. And finally, the study also found that higher neuroticism was linked to poorer performance on the trail making test overall.
Highlighting that connection between personality and cognitive function in this context.
Right, in the context of navigating a breakup.
It's a really insightful look at the multifaceted ways we respond to these big emotional challenges. Now, like any research, it's important to mention limitations, right?
Absolutely, always. The researchers themselves pointed out that their study focused specifically on women between 18 and 35.
Okay, young adult women.
Yes. So While the findings are valuable, we need to be a bit cautious about just directly applying them to, say, men or to people in different age groups.
Their experiences in coping might differ.
They might, yeah. It warrants further research across different groups.
That's an important point. So as you, the listener, think about this deep dive into the emotional aftermath of breakups, maybe consider which of these recovery paths resonates most with your own experiences.
Or with what you've seen in people you know.
Exactly. And, what do you think the longer term implications might be for someone who follows one path versus another?
Hmm.
And could a better understanding of these factors, personality, rumination style, cognitive flexibility, could that actually help us support ourselves and others better through these tough life transitions?
It certainly gives you a lot to consider, doesn't it?